The first engine came on like a question, low and uncertain in the gray before dawn, and then a second answered it, and a third, until the sound stacked itself into something that rattled the window panes of the little house at the bend of County Road 9. Margaret Vance stood at her kitchen sink with both hands flat on the cold porcelain and did not move. She was 71 years old that winter, and she had learned long ago that the sound of motorcycles meant nothing good was about to happen on a road this empty. The mug of coffee beside her had gone cold an hour ago. She had not slept. The eviction notice was still folded on the table where she had left it, and the men who sent it had promised that today was the day they would come to make it real. She counted the engines without meaning to. 10, 20. More than she could hold in her head. Naz and Idend. They were not slowing down the way trucks slowed down, the way the county surveyor's sedan had slowed down last week before the man inside rolled down his window and told her, almost gently, that she had until the end of the month. These engines were coming to a stop. She heard the gravel of her own driveway crackle under their tires, heard the chrome and the leather and the heavy boots coming down onto the frozen ground, heard the long, ragged idle of machine after machine settling in the cold, and her heart went so hard against her ribs that she pressed her palm flat to her chest as if she could quiet it by hand. She thought of the back door. She thought of the car in the side yard that would not start. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that there was nowhere left to run to, even if her knees had let her, and so she did not run. She stayed at the sink with her hands on the cold porcelain and waited to see what had come for her. Then she saw the gloves. Through the frosted glass of the window over the sink, she watched the first rider swing his leg off a black machine and pull his hands free of his grips, and on those hands were gloves. She knew she had made them. The cuff was ribbed in a dark wine red. She had dyed herself from a kit she bought at the dollar store in town, and the back of the hand carried a small cabled diamond she put into every pair because her late husband had liked the look of it. She had given those gloves away on a cold morning 8 months ago to a stranger who had stopped for gas at the pumps she used to run, before the pumps were shut off, before everything started slipping out from under her. She had forgotten his face. She had not forgotten the gloves. The man turned toward the house, and behind him the others were dismounting too. And Margaret Vance understood that she was about to find out whether the worst thing or the best thing she could imagine was standing in her driveway. She did not yet know which. Neither did they. To understand why 80 motorcycles came to a stop outside a widow's house on the coldest morning of the year, you have to go back to the gas station. And before the gas station, you have to understand what Margaret had already lost. Her husband Daniel had been gone 3 years by then. He had run the filling station at the crossroads for 41 years, a squat cinder block building with 2 pumps and a garage bay and a coffee pot that was never turned off. And when his heart gave out behind the register one August afternoon, Margaret had simply kept the doors open because she did not know how to do anything else. The station was not a business so much as a habit. The whole stretch of road shared. Truckers knew it. Farmers knew it. The men and women who rode the highway in long, loud groups on Saturday mornings knew it. And Daniel had never once treated them like trouble, which was more than they got most places. So when the cold came early that year, in the second week of October, and a rider pulled in, shivering with his bare hands, locked white around his grips, Margaret did what Daniel would have done. She came out from behind the register with the coffee pot already in her hand, because she had seen him through the glass before he even cut the engine, seen the way he flexed his fingers against the cold and could not quite make them close. She poured him a cup without asking and set it on the pump island, where he could wrap both hands around it. He nodded his thanks and did not speak, and she went back inside and stood a moment in the warm. Then she went into the back room where she kept her yarn. It was a closet, really, a shelf of skeins, and a basket of finished pairs she made through the long evenings because her hands could not stand to be idle since Daniel passed. She pulled a fresh pair of gloves off the shelf, wine-red cuff and cabled diamond, the warmest weight she made, and she carried them back out into the cold. The writer was still nursing the coffee. She held the gloves out to him. "Take these," she said. "Yours are no good to you if you can't feel the break." He looked at the gloves and then at her, and she saw him reach for his wallet the way men do when a kindness makes them uneasy. And she put her hand flat against the air between them. "I didn't offer to sell them," she said. "Put your money away. The cold's no respecter of persons, and a man on a bike has no business freezing for the sake of his pride." He pulled the gloves on. They fit. He worked his fingers once, twice, and something in his shoulders let go, and he looked at her with an expression she would not be able to name until much later, when she finally understood what kind of men keep that kind of account. He said only, "Thank you, ma'am," in a low, even voice, and then he tried once more to leave a folded bill on the island, and she took it and tucked it back into his cut pocket before he could stop her. And that was the end of the argument. His name was Cole Hutchins, though. Margaret never asked it and never learned it that day, and he was 38 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a close gray flecked beard and a quiet way of holding still when something mattered. He rode with a club out of the county seat 50 miles east, a fellowship of working men who called themselves the Iron Wens and wore a black leather cut with a patch of a compass rose stitched over a bare winter tree. Cole was their road captain, the man who planned the runs and watched the back of the pack, and he had stopped at Margaret's pumps that October morning only because his hands had gone numb and he was too stubborn to say so to the men behind him. He wore the gloves all winter. He wore them the next winter, too. The men ribbed him about the little red cuffs, and he let them, and when they asked where he got them, he said an old woman at a gas station had given them to him for nothing, and would not be argued out of it. He did not forget her. Bikers, the ones who ride for years and mean it, carry a long ledger of small kindnesses and small cruelties, and they keep the accounts more carefully than any bank. Cole kept Margaret in his. What Margaret did not know that first winter, and what she would not know for almost a year, was that her kindness had landed in the middle of a club that was watching the road for exactly that kind of thing. The Iron Wens had buried 2 of their own to the cold in the years before. Men who went down on black ice with no one near enough to find them in time, and they had made a quiet practice of the thing nobody talks about, which is that they looked out for the people on their route who had nothing and asked for nothing. A widow giving away handmade gloves at a dying gas station was to them not a small thing at all. The gas station died that next spring. Margaret had known it was coming. The supplier raised the wholesale rate past anything 2 pumps could carry, and the tank inspection she could not afford came due, and one Tuesday in April she turned the sign to closed for the last time and locked the door on 41 years. She kept the house. The house was all she had left, the little place at the bend of County Road 9 that Daniel had bought before they married, paid off and hers free and clear, or so she believed. She believed wrong, and the man who taught her she was wrong was named Gerald Pruitt. Pruitt was 56, soft-handed and silver-haired, with a tailored gray overcoat and shoes that had never seen mud, and he held the title of Regional Development Director for a holding company that had spent 2 years quietly buying every parcel along the County Road 9 corridor. There was money coming, the kind that comes when a state decides to widen a highway and put an interchange where a crossroads used to be, and Pruitt's company meant to own the ground before the announcement made it valuable. He had bought the gas station lot from the bank that held its lien before Margaret even understood it was for sale. He had bought the fields on 3 sides of her house. Her house, the last holdout, sat exactly where the company's engineers had drawn an access road, and Gerald Pruitt wanted it gone. He came to her in person the first time, which he would later regret because it meant there were witnesses. He sat in her kitchen with a leather folder and explained, in a voice as smooth and cold as the marble lobby of his office, that the deed Daniel had recorded back in the 1970s contained an error in the legal description, a surveyor's mistake that left a strip of the property technically unconveyed, and that his company had acquired the underlying interest, and that Margaret's claim to her own home was, he said with real regret in his face, not as solid as she had been led to believe. He offered her a sum to leave quietly. The sum was an insult, and they both knew it. When she refused, the regret left his face and did not come back. What followed was a slow strangling, dressed up in paper. There were letters from a law firm with 3 names on the letterhead. There was a filing at the county courthouse that Margaret could not understand and could not afford a lawyer to translate. There was a notice taped to her door by a process server who would not meet her eyes. The single lawyer in town who might have helped her had done work for Pruitt's company and could not take her case, and the legal aid office in the county seat had a waiting list that ran past the date on her eviction notice. The system that was supposed to stand between a widow and a man like Gerald Pruitt was not absent. Exactly. It was just all on his side of the table, and there was no chair left for her. She told no one. There was no one to tell. Her sister had passed the year before. She had no children. The neighbors who would have stood with her had already sold to Pruitt, moved away, their farmhouses dark, their fields signed over. Wills, Margaret Vance faced the end of the only home she had with the same thing she had faced every hard thing in her life, which was a straight back and a closed mouth and a refusal to weep where anyone could see. The road remembered her, though even when she had forgotten the road, it was Cole Hutchins who found out, and he found out by accident, the way these things travel. He had stopped at the crossroads in October, a full year after the gloves, meaning to fill his tank at the old station out of habit, and found the pumps capped and the building dark and a development company's sign staked into the lot. He sat on his idling machine and looked at that sign for a long time. Then he rode the 50 miles back to the clubhouse and asked the only question that mattered to him, which was what had happened to the woman who used to run it. It took the club's youngest patched member, a wiry 26-year-old named Eli Sundquist, who could find anything that had ever been typed into a county database, less than an hour to assemble the shape of it. Eli was the club's quiet hand, soft-spoken and pale, more comfortable with a keyboard than a wrench. What he pulled up that evening made the table in the clubhouse go very still. The recorded eviction, the development company, the pattern of purchases along the corridor, every parcel but one, all of them closed at prices that bore no relation to what the land was about to be worth. And underneath it, the thing that turned the stillness into something colder, a string of nearly identical filings against elderly owners in 3 other counties, all involving the same holding company, all hinging on the same kind of conveniently discovered deed error, all ending with the old person gone and the company holding the ground. The club president set down his coffee. His name was Walter Brenner, 63 years old, heavy-set and barrel-chested, well over 6 feet even, with the stoop the years had put in him, with a full gray beard and a leather cut that carried the word President above the compass rose patch and a faded blue tattoo of an anchor on the back of one heavy ringed hand. He had been riding for 40 years and leading the Iron Wens for 15, and the men around that table had never once seen him do anything in haste. He listened to Eli lay out every line of it. He looked at the printout of the 4 old people in 4 counties. Then he asked Cole one question, low and even. The glove woman, she ever ask us for a thing? Cole shook his head. Never asked me for the time of day. Gave me the gloves and wouldn't take $1. Walter nodded slowly, and the men who knew him knew that the nod was a decision, though he had not yet said what the decision was. He turned the printout face down on the table, which was a thing he did when he had finished thinking, and started planning. Then we owe her, he said. And we don't pay what we owe with our fists. We pay it smart. Eli, I want everything that man ever filed, every county, every old person. I want to know if any of those deed errors are real. They were not real. That was the thing that took Eli the better part of a week to prove, and the thing that made even the cold enforcer of the Iron Wens, a flat-eyed mountain of a man named Dale Okafor, who served as the club's sergeant-at-arms and rarely spoke at all, leaned forward in his chair. Dale was 44, a head taller than most men in any room, with deep brown skin and a single pale scar running through his left eyebrow, and a stillness about him that made loud men go quiet. He wore the cut with the Sergeant 8 arms patch, and he had spent 20 years learning to read when a thing was wrong. And what Eli found was very wrong indeed. The deed errors were manufactured. In every one of the 4 prior cases, and in Margaret's, the same surveying firm had produced the same kind of report, finding the same kind of discrepancy, and that firm, L.A. discovered after 3 nights of patient digging, was owned through 2 shell companies by the same holding outfit Gerald Pruitt worked for. They were not finding errors in old deeds. They were writing them on demand to order, and then using their own manufactured errors as the legal lever to pry old people off valuable land. It was not a mistake anyone had made in the 1970s. It was a machine, built in the present, and Gerald Pruitt ran the local end of it. Walter Brenner listened to all of it and was quiet for a long while. When he finally spoke, it was not about Pruitt at all. How long does she have? Eli checked. Eviction's set for the 23rd. That's 11 days. Cold snap's coming the 20th, said Cole. Worst of the winter, they're saying. 20 below with the wind. Walter stood up from the table, and standing, he filled the low room. Then, here's how it goes, he said. We do not lay a hand on that man. We do not go near him with anything he can call the law down on. We are 80 men on motorcycles, and the whole world already believes the worst of us. And the second we give him a bruise to photograph, he wins. And she loses her house. You hear me? Not a hand. The men heard him. What we are going to do, Walter said, is 2 things. Eli is going to take everything he found and put it where it cannot be buried. Lawyers, reporters, the Attorney General's office, every old family in those other 3 counties who got run off. We are going to turn his own machine inside out in the daylight where his money can't reach. And on the morning they come to put that woman out of her house, we are going to be standing in her driveway, all of us, so that when his people show up to do it, the first thing they see is who she's got behind her. Dale Okafor spoke then, which was rare enough that everyone turned. 80 bikes in her driveway, he said in his low, flat voice, scares an old woman half to death before it scares him at all. Walter looked at him, and something in the hard old face softened by a degree. You're right, he said. So somebody goes first. Somebody she might remember. His eyes moved to Cole. You gave her nothing to remember but a thank you she wouldn't take. Go give her warning first. The rest of us hold back till she knows we're friends. That was the plan, and it was a good plan, and it nearly did not survive contact with the thing none of them had counted on, which was that Gerald Pruitt moved his timeline up. He did it because Eli's quiet work had not stayed quiet enough. A reporter at the county paper, a tired woman named Frances Liddell, who had been trying for 2 years to prove what everyone along the corridor suspected, got a manila envelope on her desk with no return address, and inside it, the surveying records and the shell company filings and a printout of 4 old people in 4 counties. Frances Liddell did what reporters do. She called Pruitt's office for comment. And Gerald Pruitt, who had built his whole machine on moving faster than anyone could prove anything, understood in an instant that his window was closing, and decided that the surest way to win was to get Margaret Vance out of that house before the story broke. The deed would already be done, and the access road already surveyed across ground his company physically held. He moved the eviction up to the 18th, 2 days early, the morning before the cold snap. And he did not tell Margaret because the notice on her door already gave him the legal cover of the later date, and a sheriff's deputy could be persuaded that an earlier removal was simply efficient. Margaret learned the date had changed the way she learned everything, too late and from a stranger. The process server came back on the 17th, a young man in a windbreaker who would not meet her eyes again, and he told her the men would be there in the morning to carry her things out. And then he hurried back to his car as if the porch itself might hold him to account. She watched him drive off, and then she closed the door and stood with her back against it for a while. That night she sat at her kitchen table with the cold coffee and the folded notice, and a photograph of Daniel in his work shirt, the one where he was squinting against the sun outside the station with a wrench in his hand and grease to the elbow. She did the arithmetic of an old woman with nowhere to go. She had a sister's grave on the hill behind the Lutheran church, and a husband's grave beside it, and a house that would be a parking lot by spring. She had $31 in a coffee can on top of the refrigerator, and a car in the side yard that did not start when the temperature dropped below 20. She had a box of her mother's china she could not carry, and a wedding ring she would not sell. She had her straight back and her closed mouth, the 2 things that had carried her through Daniel's funeral and the closing of the station and every hard night since. And for the first time in 71 years she felt them both failing her at once. She did not weep. She sat very still and watched the kitchen go from dark to darker as the last light left the window. And she thought about where a person goes when there is no place left to go, and she found that she did not have an answer. She left the coffee where it was. She did not turn on a lamp. She sat in the cold dark of the only home she had ever known and waited for the morning that would take it. And somewhere east of her, 50 miles off, in a clubhouse she had never seen, 80 men were pulling on their boots in the dark. That is the morning the engines came. Cole Hutchins had ridden out from the county seat at 4 in the morning to reach her before anyone else, because Walter's plan called for her to have a friendly face first. Pruitt, though, had moved the clock, and the club's careful staging fell apart against the simple fact that when 80 men decide to be somewhere by dawn, they do not always arrive in the order you drew up the night before. Cole came up County Road 9 10 minutes ahead of the pack, and behind him, strung out along the dark highway with their headlights cutting the freezing fog, came the whole of the Iron Wens and a good many friends of the Iron Wens besides. Because word of what Pruitt's machine had done to 4 old people in 4 counties had traveled the way these things travel, rider to rider, and men who had never met Margaret Vance had rolled out of bed in the dark to sit a cold motorcycle in a stranger's driveway. So Margaret stood at her sink and watched the first man swing off his bike, and she saw the wine-red cuffs and the cabled diamond on the backs of his hands, and the bottom dropped out of her fear, and something she had no name for rushed in to fill it. Cole took off the gloves before he knocked, because he wanted her to see his hands were empty. And he stood on her porch in the freezing dark and said when she finally opened the door, a crack with the chain still on, "Ma'am, and you gave me these last year. I came to give you a hand back." She did not let him in right away. She was not a fool, and a year of Gerald Pruitt had taught her that gentle voices on her porch meant ruin. Cole did not push the door. He stood back from it. He told her plainly and quickly who he was and what his club had found, that the deed error was a lie manufactured to steal her house, that the same lie had stolen 4 other homes, that there was a reporter and a state office that knew it now, and that the men filling her driveway behind him were not there to frighten her, but to stand between her and the people coming to put her out. He told her about Walter and the plan and the cold snap and the 2 days Pruitt had stolen off the clock. He told her she did not have to trust him. He only asked that she not run from the men who had come to help. Margaret Vance looked past him at the driveway, where the fog was full of headlights and chrome and breath steaming in the cold, where rank on rank of leather-cut men stood quiet beside their machines and did not come forward and did not crowd her, and she understood that whatever this was, it was not Gerald Pruitt. She took the chain off the door. Inside, with the coffee pot, going for the first time in days because Cole had carried in a bag of grounds along with everything else, Margaret heard the whole of it, laid out a second time, slower. Eli Sundquist came in from the cold and set a laptop on her kitchen table and showed her the survey records, the shell companies, the 4 old faces in 4 counties. Walter Brenner filled her doorway and then ducked through it and sat his great bulk in the chair across from her and did not say much because he was a man who knew when a woman needed quiet more than speeches. Dale Okafor stayed by the window with his arms folded, watching the road, because somebody always watched the road. "Why?" Margaret finally asked, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "Why would 80 men I never met come out in the cold for me?" Walter answered her. "You didn't ask us to," he said. "That's the whole reason. You gave that boy gloves and wouldn't take his dollar. People who give without asking are the only people worth standing up for. The rest of the world's got plenty of folks lined up to help the ones who can pay them back." She had no answer for that. She had spent a year being told what she was worth by Gerald Pruitt's arithmetic, and here was a man with an anchor tattooed on his hand, telling her she was worth 80 motorcycles in the snow. The deputies came at 7:30. There were 2 of them. A county sheriff's car nosing up the road with its lights off, and behind it, a pair of pickup trucks carrying the men a company hires to carry a household out to the curb. They came around the bend at the bottom of County Road 9, and they stopped, all 3 vehicles, because the driveway and the shoulder and a good stretch of the road itself were filled with motorcycles and with men standing beside them. 80, strong, silent, breath fogging in the dawn. None of them moving, and none of them speaking, and not one of them holding anything in his hands. The lead deputy, a heavy-set man named Roy Castellan, who had served the county for 19 years and had no love for the job he had been sent to do that morning, rolled down his window and looked at the wall of leather and chrome and did not get out of his car. He had a court order in his hand. He also had 19 years of knowing the difference between a fight and the stand, and what he was looking at was a stand. Nobody was threatening him. Nobody had to. 80 men stood in the freezing fog around a widow's house and simply declined to make room. and there is no line in any court order that tells a deputy what to do about silence. Walter Brenner walked out to the deputy's car alone, slow, his hands loose and open at his sides, and he leaned down to the window the way a man leans down to talk to a neighbor over a fence. The men were too far to hear what passed between them. They saw Walter talk. They saw the deputy listen. They saw Walter take a folded sheaf of papers from inside his cut, the copies Eli had made, and pass them through the window, and they saw the deputy read slow, his lips moving over the lines, and then go back to the top and read again. They saw Roy Castellan look up at the dark house, and then out across the rows of motorcycles to the 80 men standing motionless in the fog, and then down again at the papers in his hands that said the deed error was a lie, and the same lie had been used 4 times before on 4 other old people. Papers that named a reporter who already had them, and a state office that had already started asking. Roy Castellan was not a hero and never claimed to be. He was, though, a man who did not want his name on the thing those papers described, and a court order to remove a widow on a manufactured deed error was a different animal entirely once a man knew it was manufactured. He keyed his radio. He spoke into it for a while. Then he rolled up his window, backed the cruiser carefully down the narrow road past the rows of bikes, and the pickup trucks backed up behind him. And they were gone. And the eviction of the 18th simply did not happen. Gerald Pruitt did not lose his house that day, even so, and a man like Gerald Pruitt does not stop because one deputy got cold feet. He lost it over the 3 weeks that followed, and he lost it the way Walter Brenner had promised at the table. Smart, and in the daylight, his own machine turned inside out, where his money could not reach. Frances Liddell ran her story on the front page of the county paper 4 days later, and because she was a careful reporter who had spent 2 years on it, she did not run an angle. She ran the documents, the manufactured surveys, the shell companies that owned the surveying firm, the 4 old people in 4 counties, each one tracked down and interviewed, each one telling the same story of a soft-handed man in a gray overcoat explaining gently that the deed they had held for 50 years was not as solid as they believed. The story did not mention the Iron Wens, except in one line near the end that said a local motorcycle club had assisted residents in gathering the records. Walter had asked for that. He did not want the story to be about 80 men in a driveway. He wanted it to be about Gerald Pruitt. It became about Gerald Pruitt. The Attorney General's office, which had received its own copy of Eli's envelope, opened an inquiry within the week. The 3 other counties opened their own. The holding company, which had a great deal of money, and a board of directors who cared about a great deal more land than one corridor in one county, did what large companies do when one of their local men becomes a liability that photographs badly. They cut him loose. By the end of the month, Gerald Pruitt was no longer the regional development director of anything. The tailored gray overcoat and the shoes that had never seen mud belonged to a man under investigation by 3 county prosecutors and a state office, a man whose own employer had publicly disavowed him, a man whose name was now attached in print to the gentle robbery of 5 old people who had worked their whole lives for the ground he tried to take. He came to the house one more time. Nobody had expected that, and afterward Margaret was the only one who saw it, because it happened on a flat gray afternoon in the first week of December, when the cold snap had passed and the men had gone back to the county seat, leaving behind only a phone number and a promise that any one of them would ride out the moment she called. She did not call. She did not need to. Gerald Pruitt came up the walk she had shoveled herself, and she watched him from the window, and she saw at once that the man who had sat in her kitchen with a leather folder and cold marble in his voice was gone. This man's overcoat was wrinkled. His silver hair was uncombed. He had the loose, unstrung look of a man who has watched the floor he was standing on turn out to be air. He did not knock. He stood on her step a moment, and then he put a single sheet of paper through the mail slot in her door, and he turned and walked back to a car that was not the expensive one he used to drive, and he left. Margaret picked the paper up off the floor. It was a quitclaim deed, signed and notarized, releasing any and all interest his shell companies had ever claimed in her property, recorded that morning at the county courthouse. There was no letter with it. There was no apology. There was only the paper, which was the only language Gerald Pruitt had ever spoken. And in the end, the paper said she had won. She stood in her hallway for a long time holding it. Then she went to the phone and called the number the men had left her, not because she needed rescuing, but because she did not know what else to do with a feeling that large. And when Cole Hutchins answered, she told him it was over, that the man had signed the house back and driven away in a smaller car. And she heard him exhale on the other end of the line and then call out the news to a room she could not see. And she heard, faint and far off, the sound of men cheering. They came back one more time before the winter ended, and this time Margaret was not afraid of the engines. It was a Saturday in the middle of February, clear and hard and bright, the snow squeaking underfoot, and they came up County Road 9 in the disciplined 2x2 formation that Walter ran on a good day, not 80 this time, but the core of them, Walter and Cole and Dale and Eli and a dozen more. And they parked in her driveway and did not stand back the way they had the first time, because they were not strangers anymore. Margaret had a pot of coffee going and a kitchen too small to hold them, so they spilled out onto the porch and the steps in the cold yard, and she went down the line pressing mugs into hands, and partway down the line she stopped because she had seen the gloves again. Not just Cole's pair, Walter Brenner wore a pair of wine red cuffs with a cabled diamond on the back. So did Dale. So did Eli and the dozen behind them, every man in the formation, each one wearing a pair of gloves she had knitted. Because in the weeks after the deputy turned his cruiser around, Cole had quietly gathered up every spare pair off the shelf in her back room before the house was emptied, and had given them out at the clubhouse, one to a man, and told them where they came from. Margaret stood in the cold with the coffee pot in her hand and looked at the rows of her own work on the hands of men who had come out in 20 below dark for a woman they had never met. And the straight back she had kept her whole life finally gave way, not into weeping, but into something steadier and warmer. The thing a person feels when the world turns out, against all the evidence, to be kinder than she had let herself believe. Walter took the coffee pot out of her hand so she would not drop it. "Careful with that," he said. "Hot." "You came back," she said. "We'll keep coming back," said Walter. "You're on the road now. That means you're ours to look after, and the road doesn't forget its own." He did not explain what that meant, because the warmth of the iron winds was never in their words. It was in the thing itself, in 80 engines in the fog, in a deputy's cruiser backing down a narrow road, in 12 pairs of wine-red gloves, on a bright February morning. Margaret Vance, who had spent a year being told what she was worth, came at last to understand that she belonged to something that did its accounting in kindness, and that she had been entered into its ledger the moment she gave a cold stranger a pair of gloves. She kept the quitclaim deed in the same drawer as the photograph of Daniel, and she did not look at it often. She did not need to. The proof that she was home was not on paper. It was the sound, on a cold morning every few weeks, all that winter and the winters after, of engines coming up County Road 9, slowing down, coming to a stop in her driveway, and the smell of coffee and exhaust and old leather, drifting in through a door she now opened wide. If this story warmed something in you this cold season, if you believe a small kindness given to a stranger can come back, changed beyond all measure, stay with that feeling for a moment, and then pass it on to someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.